Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome. It is Tuesday. It is 4 p.m. ET, and you have found us here at Crime Time on A Mighty Blaze. And we are so thrilled that you are here today, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I am your host, Phillippi Ryan, the USA Today bestselling author of 14 novels of suspense. The newest is The House Guest, which went into a second printing after 6 days. So that is marvelous, and it is because of you. And I am incredibly grateful for that. Speaking of incredibly grateful, you all, look who is here today. Jacqueline Winspear, who has a new book, The White Lady. I am honestly trying to be cool about this, but this is Jacqueline Winspear, who is such an icon and such a brilliant writer. And this brand new book, which we'll talk all about in a minute or two, is, oh golly, it's atmospheric, it's touching, it's life-changing, it's poignant, it's human, oh golly, all those things. And we will talk all about that. It's powerful, isn't it? And it's authentically wonderful. But if you don't believe me, which you should, believe Louise Penny, who says The White Lady is a triumph of storytelling, a fast-paced, thoughtful, bold, and nuanced thriller that is thrillingly human, a thriller that is thrillingly human. Louise Penny says, I loved it, she says, and so do I. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Jacqueline Winspear. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'm absolutely thrilled. Thank you. As I just said, I'm incredibly honored to be interviewed by you.
That's just me. I feel just the same way about you. But talk about when you read that, accolade from Louise Penny, who really got this book. What did you think about that?
Well, it wasn't so much a matter of thinking as almost falling off my chair. I mean, I had that moment when you can't breathe, and then you're aware that your clothes are moving because your heart's going like that, and I just couldn't believe it. It was such a wonderful endorsement, the sort of endorsement you absolutely dream about as a writer. And even after a given number of books, it's just so exciting. And it was incredibly gracious of her to read the book and then to have those thoughts about it. Was just wonderful, really wonderful.
After all your massive success and after the place that you have created for yourself in writing world, it cannot, though, be easy to think about Louise Penny holding your book and reading your book.
No, it's not easy to think about. It's not, because you don't think of yourself as someone who is in a certain position of having written so many books. Every time I sit down to write a book, I feel as if, I'm very new to the game. And I also have a feeling that they're going to find me out now, that I don't know what I'm doing. But I think that's, in a way, there's a certain healthiness to that, that you come to something as a beginner, wanting to do something different, perhaps wanting to create something, and you work so hard at it, and then have Louise Penny say that about it, and to have those thoughts about something you've created is incredibly heartwarming, to say the very least. Incredibly.
I love what you said about being a beginner every time, because a wonderful author like you are is going to challenge herself with the beginning of every new book, including The White Lady, which is not only a new book, but a new character. And you think, I'm going to take a step into a new world, and I'm going to try to be the best I can be at this. Is it hard? Is it difficult for you to type chapter 1 and start?
Well, where does the difficulty start? It wasn't just that it was a new character. I wanted to weave a timeline. So the braiding was daunting. And, of course, it was about 3 years ago. When was it? 2018, that I first spoke to my editor about this book, and she's very excited about it. And then comes the day when, as they say, the rubber hits the road. And it was that intense feeling of, can I pull off what I want to pull off? Can I do it? And it was almost like having a really difficult knitting pattern when all you've done before is ever knitted a scarf, you know, because there was all this weaving to be done. And in fact, for the first time in my life, I did what I call storyboarding.
Oh.
You know, I had my key scenes and I literally, you know, stuck my little cards on a frame in my office, and I moved them around till I got it where I thought I wanted it. But it was so, braiding is the word that comes to mind, and it was daunting. Would I pull it off? Would I slot the pieces in the right place? And then the characters, would they come alive as I wanted them to come alive? And I think one of the most important things, Hank, is to write from the heart. And that's what I did. And I'm one of these people, I sort of start at the beginning and work till I get to the end. I don't suddenly think, well, I'll do this bit here. And I've never done that. But, you know, all the time I had to write with this intense feeling about my characters.
Well,
and it was a challenge.
You were saying, I forgive me for interrupting you. You said it was a challenge. I love that. You know, it's terrifying and it's empowering, that kind of a challenge. Let me tell you quickly, we'll get to all of that in a minute, to welcome you again to Crime Time on A Mighty Blaze. If you don't know about A Mighty Blaze, it was started 3 years ago in the beginning of the pandemic by the powerhouse duo of Caroline Levitt and Jenna Blum, to keep us all together in a community, keep us all reading, keep us all writing, introduce us to new authors, discover new books, and also chat with some of our dear iconic favorites like Jacqueline Winspear. And one more bit of housekeeping, 2 more bits. One, Jacqueline is giving away a copy of The White Lady to one super lucky commenter. So leave a question or a comment or just general adulation in the comments. And at the end, we will spin the wheel of fun and you will win a copy of The White Lady. Let me quickly also introduce Jacqueline formally, in case you are new to her. You lucky people. If you are new, you have a treat in store, but I bet many of you are already fans. Pamela Fry-Priest is here, and Renee is here, and Shannon Hansen is here. So many people are here today. This is great. And when I look over here, you all, I'm looking at the comments. I'm not looking away for the screen. Susie Baldwin, yay. Anyway, Jacqueline Winspear is the author of several New York Times bestsellers in her historical fiction series featuring Maisie Dodds, another icon. She has won numerous awards for her work, including the Agatha, Alex, and Macavity Awards. She was born and raised in the county of Kent in England. Her grandfather had been severely wounded and shell-shocked in World War I, and learning his story sparked her deep interest in the war to end all wars and its after effects, which would later form the background of her novels. She studied at the University of London's Institute of Education and later worked in academic publishing, in higher education, and in marketing communications in the UK before emigrating to the United States, where she lives now. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Tell us, now I'm finally going to let you talk. Can you imagine?
That's okay.
Tell us a little bit about The White Lady. It's new, with a new character, new everything.
You know, I've got to tell you, to start off with, I've never been one of these people that can say in 100 words that I could quite easily say in sort of 400,000. The White Lady, I think why it means so much to me is it was inspired by someone that whose path I crossed when I was just, believe it or not, 3 years old. And so one of those people that stayed with me as a little girl. And then later on, you know, I became more interested in women, particularly women in a time of war. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to take a woman through 2 world wars, but not just, you know, as if being a civilian is a just situation, but I wanted to take her through 2 world wars as some kind of operative. In fact, as a trained killer. And I didn't know how I was going to do that. I could get her in one war, because we often think of, you know, operatives, intelligence operatives as, you know, adults, not as kids. How was I going to get her through 2? And it was when I was writing A Lesson in Secrets, I was doing more research, that I found out about the organization in World War I Belgium, that was recruiting girls and women for acts of sabotage, intelligence gathering, and even assassination. And I thought, now I have it. And so what I've done is taken Eleanor DeWitt, which means white. And also she becomes Eleanor White later in the UK, but taken her through 2 world wars. And what I wanted to explore, and it's not only with her character, but what does that do to a person? What did those experiences do to her, particularly as a young girl learning the art of killing? How does that affect someone? And what I then did was to plunge her into post-World War II Britain and the world of organized crime, which was a very healthy world in those circumstances, let's say. You know.
Well, why was it important to you to have both wars included?
It was the arc of the story, because I've often thought of those 2 wars not as 2 wars, but 1 war. To me, it was another 30 years, European 30 years war. If you consider without, sort of beating everyone over the head with history, but the unresolved circumstances of the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 that led to dissent, particularly in Europe, and took us towards another war. And it was almost like history repeating itself again, because people forget about the other war in the middle, which was they don't forget about it, but slotting into that is the Spanish Civil War, which is where Adolf Hitler did a very memorable practice run for his notion of blitzkrieg. And that was Guernica. That was the Luftwaffe. So, and I've in a way, I've done that with Maisie Dobbs. I've taken her through World War I, and we're in World War II at the moment. But I wanted to do it within the framework of 1 book. And I wanted this woman whose path I crossed when I was 3 years old.
And who was she?
We lived in a very rural area when I was a kid. My parents had come from London, and I'm a mid-50s baby, and we were living in what was called a tied cottage, which meant it was tied to a job in the land. And in fact, the job was my mother's job. She was the bookkeeper for 4 farms run by the same farmer. In the midst of this big forest, we lived on the edge of the forest. So every day, it seemed like every day to me, it could have been 4 days a week. I honestly don't know. But after my dad went off to work, off we went, my mum and I, up the road, and then on a woodland path down to the farm where she worked in the office. And it seemed that this lady passed us almost every day. And you never seemed, and children, they can't always explain what they feel and understand. But it seemed to me that you never saw her to the last minute, because she always seemed to be dressed for the day. If it was autumn, it was browns and greens, and hat pulled down, collar pulled up. And she very rarely said hello, or acknowledged. She would maybe give a nod. And my mother was one of these people, good morning, very jolly person. And then one day I decided to say hello. And she suddenly looked at me in shock, like the child speaks. And she smiled and said, well, hello. And she nodded to my mum and walked on. And my mum, I still remember this, looking over her shoulder to make sure the woman was out of earshot. Well, she was gone by then. She'd sort of evaporated into thin air. And my mum leaned down to me and said, she's one of those women who parachuted into France during the war. And I think she realized that this was a story for later when I said, what's parachuted? But what I understood was the notion of secrecy. I had no words to understand that, but I never forgot her, and I never forgot that story. And in fact, when my brother first got his hands on the white lady, he said, oh, is this the one about the woman that your mum used to see, And
you take us there. When you're describing that powerful story.
Yes.
Powerful story, you take us there so beautifully in this book, and the emotion and the connection and the almost mystical white lady, which is so ghostly anyway, and how that little tiny nugget of information blossomed into this novel after all those years.
After very many years. and it's the last ice age, and I think that the thing was that it eventually, even as an 8-9-year-old, I had this interest in women's history. I wouldn't have put it like that, but I was, we did, for example, a project at school every year from 8 years old onwards, and it was called Our Topic. And you had to basically write a little book And it was about something that you were interested in, and the research was referred to as finding out. And mine was famous women. I think I've still got the book lurking somewhere, actually. And I, I wrote about this in my memoir, This Time Next Year We'll Be Laughing, the reasons why I eventually, even as a teenager, was very interested in the role of women in wartime. The role of women in wartime.
And Lee Child said this book was a tribute to the bravest women of the 20th century. And it's so powerfully true in this book. Talk a little bit about that, about bravery and what bravery means. Bravery can be huge and it can be tiny.
I think bravery, and people have struggled with this. How do we define bravery? And I think bravery is when you know you have fear. And interestingly enough, just recently I wrote a book. I was commissioned to write an article on courage, and I actually interviewed my godson, who he's an officer in the British Army. He's done 4 tours of duty in Afghanistan as well as other places. He's currently responsible for training Ukrainian civilians to fight. And I asked him about courage. He said, yes, people say, yes, we're brave. He said, but we're all really, he said, fear is what we know. Fear, he said, it's taking that fear, but doing the job anyway. And he was giving me various examples. And so I think with these women who are involved in different roles in the war, not just those who worked behind lines and so on, but those who worked in munitions factories, the ATS girls that were sort of manning what they call the ACAC stations, anti-aircraft, they knew they could be blown up at any second. So what makes people do that? And it's taking a job that you can do, that you feel a responsibility to do. And even though what you're doing is terrifying, you get there and do it anyway. And I think we've all had that feeling of fear, whether it be, I show in dressage, we were just talking about, I'm terrified. Terrified. And yet I do it, and sometimes a couple of times it's got the better of me. But
well, Edith, there's physical fear and there's emotional fear, and those both come together so beautifully.
Absolutely.
In The White Lady. Talk a little bit about that, how deadly emotional fear is and how destructive emotional fear is, and how we deal with physical fear. Talk about emotional fear.
That's a really interesting concept. And, I think back to someone like my mother, who had many stories of being a youngster in World War II Britain. And, there's one story that sticks with me. And in fact, it was told me by my aunt, her sister, that they were walking along home. They were in their mid-teens, but they were out to work. You went to work when you were 14. That was the school leaving age. And they were walking home in the blackout. That means you couldn't see anything in front of you. During an air raid, bombers are overhead. And I remember my aunt said to me, your mom turned around and said to me, come on, we're going to sing and dance our way home, because if we sing and dance, we won't be scared. And I think of that, and I myself have a huge emotional response. And so I think there is that the emotional bravery is in, perhaps it's not, and I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I think it's in knowing that we're feeling something. But again, you've got to get home. You've got to do this. And, some of those women in World War II, in particular, going into, parachuting into France, parachuting into Belgium, and going into other areas, they had kids at home. They had children. And they were doing that because they wanted their children to live in a better world, that they wanted to stop the war for their children.
And so much of that is in The White Lady as well, which I hope you will all read, not right now, but in about 15 minutes. Tell us a little bit about this new character, Eleanor White. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does she do in this book? Why do you love her? Did she spring fully formed, or did she reveal herself to you?
I think it was really revealing over a great many years. Oh, goodness me. because I wanted to write this story, the arc of a story of a woman that has served in 2 wars in a clandestine role, I sort of had the adult Eleanor, or whoever she was going to be called. And it was, as I said, while I was writing A Lesson in Secrets, I was doing some research on women working in intelligence in World War I, read a terrific book about female intelligence. And that's when I found out about La Dame Blanche, the White Lady, which was this organization in Belgium in World War I. And because so many of the men that were in the army, they were at the front. And when the Kaiser's army moved into occupy Belgium, I'll be snappy about this because I know I can go on. They have
hear this forever. We love it.
When the Kaiser's army moved in, they took men who could still fight, who were old, maybe they were getting on, but they could still had some fight in them, and boys on the cusp of manhood, and they took them away either to work camps or they shot them, which left chiefly, but not exclusively, women and girls. And so La Dame Blanche, and it wasn't just women who were part of this organization, there were men as well, but girls, 9, 10-year-olds, right up to elderly women, became engaged in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and even assassination. And this organization was bankrolled by the British from a base in the Netherlands. And it was called La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. And this is something that fascinated me. After a myth, after a legend, a German legend, and the legend basically told the story that the fall of the, and here's a word that I have to get my head around, Hohenzollern dynasty would fall with the appearance of a woman wearing white. And the Kaiser was part of that dynasty, hence the La Dame Blanche. And as someone, I love old myths and legends, and it's interesting that there is a legend of the White Lady in almost every culture in the world. And she's a shaman, she's a healer, she portends death, she portends life, she portends birth. It's interesting to me. So hence, Eleanor is part of La Dame Blanche in Belgium, born of a Belgian father and an English mother. And I decided to play with the white. And one of the sort of, if you will, family jokes is around the fact that her father's name is DeWitt and her mother's was White. So Eleanor and her sister are the White sisters, if you will. And she starts off as Eleanor DeWitt and becomes Eleanor White, because after her father goes to the Belgian front, she and her sisters try to escape. They miss the last boat out of Belgium. They have to remain in Belgium. But later on, I'm not going to spoil any of the story, there is reason for them then to somehow, by hook or by crook, they have to get to Britain. And so she becomes very English, if you will. And I don't want to tell you more.
No, I do. I want to hear this. I just want to remind people that we're talking about the White Lady.
The White Lady.
Jacqueline Winspear, and to tell you that every single thing that you're saying is totally giving me goosebumps about this, all of the layers and all of the meaning and all of the lore about it, and the portentousness of the White Lady, who is powerful, but in the guise of women, young women and women throughout, these brave women. As you got to know her in this story, as you were writing it, and you said you did it linearly, as you got to know her in the story, how did you feel about that? How did you change in writing her, or did you?
Well, it had a terrific impact on me, I have to tell you. Because one of the things that I feel very strongly about personally is children in war zones, children in a time of war. And part of that is due to my family history. And it was when I read, just as a preamble, a book by Dr. Martin Parsons called War Child. He was the founder of the Institute for the Study of the War Child at the University of Reading in Britain. And it was very interesting to me that his research revealed that an experience of war, particularly in childhood, takes 3 generations to go through the family system. So that means that, as an example, there are children that are engaged or have been in Ukraine today that their grandchildren will not really understand why they have certain behaviors, certain beliefs, and so on, particularly behaviors that were actually rooted in their grandparents' experiences. And one of those behaviors is actually hypervigilance, that something is going to happen, something terrible is going to happen, and we're going to have to stop it before it gets there, you know. And I have to tell you, my mother was a classic example of that. And so here I am with Eleanor, who is a child when she engages in the work of war and understanding of war. And how does that impact her? And for me, writing the book, and as I said, I write very much from the heart. It's who I am. And I think so many writers do. We just don't always talk about it. But it was emotionally very deeply exhausting in a way.
Well, you were I mean, in your biography, it talks about your grandfather, I think it was.
Yes.
And you in the novel talk about the weight of war, the weight,
yes.
WEIGHT, the weight of war, and how that changes people. So was that released for you at all in the novel? And also, did it sort of increase the sorrow about other children in war?
I think what it did, I've always carried that sorrow to a certain extent, to be perfectly honest, but it made me even more not just sorrowful, but asking myself, what can I do about this? And in fact, I wrote an essay about children in a time of war. It's on the website. You can search for it, of my British publisher, Allison and Busby. But I sort of thought, what can I do? What can I do? So, I mean, literally last year, it was in the midst of writing this, I sat down one day and I just thought, okay, what are the organizations that are working in Ukraine for children? And, you know, just donate it away. But that's all you can do, isn't it? You know, but I think it's, yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things, I mean, it's so consciousness raising for people who read this book, because history is so such a mirror and so repetitive. Yeah. And you can't help but think about now, and you can't help but think about then, and how similar that is. And the whole thing is just, it's heartbreaking and wonderful and completely immersive. And Eleanor White becomes a real person. Forgive me, I wrote in this book a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the plot. I wrote in this book. It's an advanced reader copy, so forgive me for writing in it. But
you can scribble.
I wrote repayment and payback. I wrote repayment and payback in the margin. Do you talk a little bit about the roles that those words play in this book?
Eleanor always feels in a way that she has to keep one step away from fate, because she feels that fate is in pursuit of her because of things that happened in the First World War, and particularly an event in the Second World War. And she feels that she is, and that's how she gets involved with in the organized crime, and that's how she doesn't even understand truly her knee-jerk reaction to protect a child. And as the reader will come to realize, they realize really that she doesn't even acknowledge that. She just knows that she has to protect this child. And she has to protect this child because not all wars happen on battlegrounds. We know that very well in America, don't we? And organized crime is a battleground. Places where weapons can be found amongst civilians are battlegrounds. And she finds herself a different kind of battleground, and it is because of a child.
And it's just so powerful. I mean, it's talk about powerful. This book is also about power and corruption and hierarchy. But let's go. I want to, before I go through that though, going back to payback and repayment, she lives in a grace and favor house, and I had never heard that expression before. And
Yeah.
that's also about repayment. Talk a little bit about what that is.
A grace and favor house. I mean, my parents, for example, lived in a tied cottage. Now, that was a cottage, small, tied to the job and the land. And this big estate that they lived on the edge of, it was just massive forestry area, went on for miles. And it was then what was known as crown lands. And I'm using this example to answer your question. As crown lands, it belonged to the monarchy. And later went through various other sort of government ownerships. Along the way were a couple of houses dotted, much larger houses, I might add, but still old cottages, older. Oh, when does a cottage become a house? You know, but let's just say that they looked like houses to us, but they were still probably cottages. But they were grace and favor homes. Now, it is now I have to try and remember the exact order, but it's basically the grace and favor of the monarch for services rendered to the monarchy. So who gets a grace and favor home? It could be a former lady in waiting to the monarch, or a valet. It could be a government minister who has served in a certain capacity and served the crown. It could be someone who has given extraordinary service to the country. And the lady who I saw when I was a kid, she lived in a grace and favor home because of her for what she did for the country, her service to her country by the grace and favor of the monarch. I mean, it just so happens that, I think Prince Andrew lives in a grace and favor home that everybody wants him to get chucked out of at the moment, for obvious reasons.
It does give, and so people know which those homes are?
Often they do, but not necessarily. And it's
a history, though, doesn't it?
I'm sorry?
It gives the occupant a history, an instant history.
Absolutely. Yes.
If you know what it is.
Yes. I mean, in where we lived, you obviously knew which ones the grace and favor homes, because you knew that the entire forest area belonged to the crown, belonged to the monarch. The farms within there were all leased, and they had been leased for generations from the monarch, from the crown. So the farmer that had 4 farms, his father before him and his father before him had been the tenant. It's really feudal.
It's set. Let me go forward because we're running out of time. I can't believe it. In a minute, we'll take questions from the people in the chat. Thank you all for being here today, Shannon and Sherry and Pamela. This is marvelous. Pamela says, I'm learning so much today. That's our goal. I love it. I hope one of the things that you learn is to run right out and get Jacqueline Winspear's The White Lady. Let me read you a little tiny bit, you all, of what Jacqueline wrote that was very powerful to me as well. The bombing of Britain's cities brought death and despair, along with a resilience that was already the stuff of proud reminiscence. Everyone had a tale to tell, but there was another side to the story. Wartime conscription had sucked in the bad along with the good, and while the bad could fight with uncommon ferocity, they had returned battle-hardened and with darker skills in the art of killing, learned in the prosecution of war. Demobilization had brought them home to the streets, and with a bounty of weapons that should have been left behind. I almost burst into tears. Talk a little bit about that and why that is, if you think it is, so pivotal to the story.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, organized crime, as it absolutely went through the roof during World War II. And what do I mean by organized crime? Black market in rationed goods, and then there were the forgeries of Russian books and things like. Whenever there's want, there is someone who will find a way to make up for the want. So, for example, the interesting thing is that the people would not, often believe that the crooks were actually, and when I say these people were ruthless, we're not talking about Robin Hoods here. We're talking about ruthless criminals who exploited a time of war. Now, a lot of those criminals, it eventually ended up in the armed services. Here's the interesting thing, that immediately, in the years after the war, and I think it was in 1946, 1947, they had to have amnesties for guns. Now, we all know that, you think of Britain as a country without guns. I think it was something in the order of 75,000 weapons were handed in. And the government paid you to give up your gun. Where did those guns come from? They came from the bodies of perhaps German soldiers. A Luger was particularly handy to get hold of. People brought home their guns, particular firearms, and managed to keep them. But here's another interesting source. The Americans left, obviously, I mean, we had loads of American soldiers in Britain, thousands of American soldiers. American bases had been built very quickly and remained so. The Americans shipped out, and they left behind all manner of things, including weapons. They left behind Harley Davidsons. They left behind blankets. They left behind canned goods. I mean, it was a case of, we just want everybody home, let's get out of here. And the stuff they left behind was phenomenal. Weapons very quickly fell into the hands of organized crime. And so you get to 1947, and all sorts of new and interesting ways of making money came along, and a need for that. So, for example, I can remember my mum telling me this: if someone knocked at the door that you didn't know and said, "Do you want to buy £2 of sugar for X amount?" She said no one was going to turn that down. You asked no questions, hear no lies. You just took that sugar in because no one had had sugar in their tea for a long time. And even though you knew that sugar was probably from a job at the Tate and Lyle factory, that even the people at Tate and Lyle had not reported, because they didn't want any trouble either. There was the doping of dogs and horses, and that's an interesting one, because at a time of want, people often have dreams of having something. That's why people rush out and buy lottery tickets, even though they don't have enough money to spend on lottery tickets, because we might just get rich. And so the dog tracks, the horse tracks became very big business. One of the ways those weapons were deployed, particularly around about 1947, believe it or not, there was a run on diamonds, which meant smash and grab raids at jewelers. Why was there a run on diamonds? Well, troops had come home, people were getting engaged, and a very famous young woman got engaged and married in 1947, and that was Princess Elizabeth. And it set a run on diamonds, a run on engaged. Everybody wanted to get married. Everybody wanted to get engaged the same year, because she was marrying a man called Philip Mountbatten. But it's interesting that there was also a belief, these crime lords had their own, what they call their manor, and it was their area of operations. Their own neighborhood was their manor. And there was a great belief that they kept the streets clean. They kept their own streets clean of prostitution, of all manner of threats to the local population. So whilst they weren't Robin Hoods, and people knew they weren't Robin Hoods, there was a certain gratitude for keeping the local streets clean. And whereas the police were virtually powerless to do that. It was a very interesting time. And just as an aside, the final dregs of bomb sites weren't cleared in Britain until they put up the stadiums in the East End for the 2012 Olympics.
I mean,
when I was a kid, 20 years after the war, we used to go up to London to see our relatives in London. I used to play with my cousins on bomb sites, and I was a child of fields and forests, and they were children of the city.
You should see, when this is over in about 10 minutes, go to the comments and just look and see the adulation and the engagement and the great conversations. So much interesting history. Oh, wow. I'm loving all of this. So your fans are many and legion, and the White Lady is absolutely fabulous. I have two more questions and then we will go. One is,
okay,
personally, your writing is so tough but delicate at the same time. It's just so deeply authentic, but it has this Winspear touch. just so lovely to read, even though it's about difficult things. There's a scene that's related about something that describes Eleanor, what she did in a butcher shop and how she caught the butcher. And the dialogue is beautiful, and the time is beautiful, and the setting is perfect, and the whole thing is just so beautifully cinematic and perfect. Talk a little bit about, when is it, are you a do you work and worry and frown as you write, or are you transported as you write? Can you talk for a minute about that?
It's a difficult question to answer because I don't think too much about it. I'm a very visual person, so I'm writing what I'm seeing in my head. I'm writing the dialogue I'm hearing as if I'm in the room with these people. And I'm also transported back to, say, when I was a kid watching, and I was born, 10 years after the end of the war. So I didn't see these things, but I've heard about them. I know about, the butchers that, were fiddling the books and fiddling their customers and so on. But what I remember, the way that life was, because I was raised in the country, and I often felt that, and I'll give you an example. It was, which book was I writing? My agent actually said to me, do you think of yourself as a child of the 50s or the 60s? And I said, well, until I was about 13, I felt like an Edwardian child, because there was almost this time warp. I mean, I thought my cousins in London lived really modern lives and they could get stuff that we couldn't. There was still an element that I felt that we were kind of stuck in a different time. So the shops where we went in the little town near where we lived hadn't changed since my parents first went there when they first came from London. So the way that people engage, I mean, my cousins and aunts and uncles in London, they all went to supermarkets, but there was no supermarket as such. It was still a shop where you said, oh, can I have half a pound of that? And they'd get the half a pound down. Could I have this? You didn't just go in and grab. For example, there was the conversation between different people, and I can still hear those conversations. And in my research, I immerse myself in the history. And part of my research is also listening to audio from another time, audio recollections and so on. And I think it's really important to get the rhythm of speech correct, for example. But that comes quite easily because I heard it in the elderly people that I grew up with, and I can transport myself back. So really, in the summing up, I don't think about my writing as I'm writing. I'm just writing the story that's in my head. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
I'm transcribing notes.
I feel that way as well. And I've heard other authors feel that way as well when we, at a moment when we kind of get lucky, when we're sort of just being who the character is in that time. You sort of can't make it happen, but when it does happen, you're just there. I mean, it's just, it's wonderful. And you take us there so beautifully in The White Lady. My final question would be that, and I hope this isn't treading, but Library Journal called this riveting, and it called it a standalone. Please tell me that this is not a standalone. Well,
it is. It's really hard to say. It's not a series. There might one day be a sequel. Just like, in 2014, I wrote The Care and Management of Lies, which was actually not a mystery. It was a war story. And I still get so many emails about that book. And it's only in the last, and I always thought maybe one day I'll write a sequel. It's only literally in the last, I would say 3-4 months that the sequel that I was tinkering with, I finally realized I had it in my hand. So I would love the opportunity to write that. I'm already thinking of something in terms of a sequel to The White Lady, but it's not quite there. It's not quite there with me yet. I haven't quite. It's almost like catching rose petals. You have a few, and then you have a few more, and it takes time. And I'm not a rusher of things, so to speak. I don't want to rush that process. But I don't think there's a place for this to be a series. I think that would be gratuitous to make her into some kind of sleuth.
No, but there
And,
might
and
be an adventure or another. I mean,
there is a situation that would be very authentic for this person to engage in.
I hear you about series, and I understand
Yeah.
that. Because this is a big, powerful, meaningful book. And let me assure you all that it ends gorgeously with the questions that need to be answered, all answered. And you will close this book and you will say, oh, I love this book.
Oh,
and
it's so lovely of you.
I love Eleanor. And I'm so eager for you all to have this experience. We have time for just a couple of questions. In the back room, let's see what we have. Did the people from the organization speak with you? Jacqueline says, Renee.
Which organization?
Well, I think it would have been a long time ago. Did you talk to any women who were spies who were in the clandestine service?
No, actually, because most of the women that would have been engaged as spies in World War One have all passed.
Yes.
In terms of the Second World War, it was a question of very much reading and listening to audio. And also really paying attention to the history of what really happened to those women.
And you read them in the obituaries. You read these incredible stories of the women who never told, never talked about it. And then when they die, you realize that they, led American soldiers over the Pyrenees or whatever. And you think,
yes,
we didn't know that. I mean, I get goosebumps from it. So
exactly. So I didn't have a chance to talk to anybody personally. No.
It's some things can be imagined based on research. And I think what you do so gorgeously. Mighty Blaze says, Margaret in the back room says, do you have a list as long as your arm for topics to research and any nonfiction projects in the offing?
Possibly a book on women and war.
Imagine that.
There's a surprise.
Yeah. Never a dull moment. One last question. Is there one more question? Will you be writing? Oh, good, Carol. Thank you. Because here is the question. Will you be writing any more Maisie Dobbs books? Everyone loves Maisie Dobbs.
I will indeed. But I will say there are more behind me than there are in front of me, obviously. But yes, there will be more. I can't say right now how many, but there will be.
You never know. And on that lovely high note, we thank you so much, Jacqueline Winspear. Let's draw for the winner of the lady. We will spin the wheel.
Got the book here.
Here we go with the wheel of fun, which will spin and pick a winner at random. I know Margaret in the control room is hoping that she wins this, but we can't have. But the winner is Renee Herskowitz. Wonderful. Thank you, Renee. Renee is a marvelous veteran of crime time. Did you win the last book as well? Tell me if you did, Renee, if you won on the last show. If you did, we're going to pick one more time, and the winner will be Cindy Brown. Yay. This is great. And it's so nice to see you, Cindy Brown. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So Renee, I think you won in the last show. I think you won Reef Road. If you did, that's great and hooray. And then Cindy will win this. Cindy will win no matter what. If you didn't win in the last show, this is book. Then I will send you a copy of The White Lady as well, because we do not want you to miss out. We just want everybody to have a chance to win. Renee says, I won the last show. This is your lucky day, sister. This is Congratulations, and thank you for your graciousness. Congratulations, Cindy Brown. You're the winner of our giveaway. So email me at that address and we will get you this book. Jacqueline, thank you. Thank
you.
With you.
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you for your very insightful questions. It's been lovely. It's been really lovely, and a lovely opportunity to talk about the book and to talk about my passion, which is the subject of women and children in wartime. Yeah. And
you will get that so gorgeously in The White Lady by Jacqueline Winspear. I highly, superly, beyond recommend it. You will absolutely adore this, you all. Before you go, let me say, find us here again, 4 p.m. ET, next Tuesday on Crime Time for, look at this brand new book by
Wow.
Susan Patterson, Things I Wish I Told My Mother, with her husband, James Patterson, which I think, talk about brave, right, Jacqueline, to
I
have
say so.
write a book when she is married to James Patterson. But she wrote this, she did this with Susan DeLallo. Apparently, her husband brought them coffee and donuts while Susan book. That is what. So it is marvelous. It is very sweet. It is tender. It will bring up memories of your own, I bet, for every one of us. So we will see you next Tuesday at 4:00 for Susan Patterson, Things I Wish I Told My Mother. Again, thank you, Jacqueline, for being here. Thank all of you for being here today. I love it when you come to Crime Time. It is so great. So we'll see you next week. And until then, remember, it is always safe inside a book. And we will see you next time.